Well, welcome. Tonight, we've got some special people to talk about an area where so many people benefit, but so few people actually understand what it means. So before we get into talking about palliative care, why don't we start with introductions?
I'm John Ferrari, and I'm here to represent the Milford Regional Medical Center Patient and Family Advisory Council, who has kind of adopted this issue, working with the physicians at the hospital to try to promote it to the public, a better understanding of palliative care.
When we talk about PFAC, most people won't understand it.
Under Massachusetts law, hospitals in the state are required to have a community advisory group, and it's the Patient and Family Advisory Council. And it's been in existence 6 or 7 years now, and it's very active at Milford Regional, very much tied into the management of the hospital, and it's basically a feedback group. It adopts issues on its own to promote out to the community, but many of the items are brought forth by the medical staff with asking for our help. How do we get the message out to the community?
And you're a board member.
And I'm a board member for the Healthcare Foundation, and I'm on the building committee, and I'm on the only non-employee on the PI committee, which is process improvement. So I'm very active with the medical center.
And when we think about how much money was raised, for the new ER, the new emergency room, the Taj Hopkins couldn't have happened if we hadn't gotten the community support of
Correct.
$25 million.
Correct.
And Mr. Bogey running around to make sure things happen.
Yes, and Mr. Bogey is keeping me busy on other things too with the
I was going to say,
hospital.
you just thought he was going to let you off the hook. As soon as the ER was built, he found new things for you to do.
Absolutely, but I know Bogey is my neighbor in Hopkinton, so I know that's never the case.
And
I'm Dr. Anthony Wilson. I am one of the palliative care doctors who works at Milford Regional Medical Center. I've actually been in Milford working at the hospital for 11 years. Most of the time I was working as a hospitalist, but I transitioned to doing a fellowship, which is 1 year of special training in hospice and palliative care, and came back to Milford Hospital after I did that training to continue to work at Milford and work specifically in that area.
where are you originally from?
I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Oh, you didn't go too far then.
So I've been in Massachusetts my whole life.
We were laughing about what an impact UMass has had. Because when I was sophomore, junior in college at Holy Cross, they had just opened up UMass Medical. So there was one class in there was empty. So whenever finals came and you needed a quiet place to study, with part of the consortium, we could go hide over at UMass Medical. But they didn't have the biotech park. None of that was there. It's just amazing what it's grown into.
It's very amazing. It's very technological for the students. The way they learn is extremely different from the way I learned when I was there in medical school. And I am amazed at the technologies that are now available to students.
And somebody who's been around a little more than 11 years.
A lot longer than 11 years, thank you. I'm Bill Muller. I'm a general internist. My primary practice is at a community health center in Uxbridge, which is actually part of the UMass Memorial System. I've been a staff member at Milford Regional since 1979. Have served in a variety of roles there, including president of medical staff, head of the executive committee. I was a vice president of medical affairs for about 10 years. I'm now a trustee, and I'm also on the foundation board. But I've been here, throughout the growth and progress that's been made in Milford. And to some degree, since I represent both the UMass part of that arrangement and the Milford part of that arrangement, I think it's really been to the benefit of both institutions, and certainly to the benefit of people who live in this area.
Well, certainly it's meant so much when we tied together with UMass and the Brigham and Dana-Farber as far as the care you could get locally. Just amazes me at the level of care. And then the physicians who stay. You know, because you say 10 years, well, some 30 years, but it's
Almost 40 years.
almost 40. But it's not uncommon. You know, people who've come on the show that, well, I've only been here 25 years. It's like, only?
Mhm.
When you figure that as an MD, you start your career about when it's almost time to retire anyway, especially if you do specialties.
Yes.
People in general, if I was to ask them, what is palliative care? I don't know that most people would truly understand it. Could you explain it to us?
Sure.
Well, Anthony's the expert. We'll let him start.
In fact, there was a study done in 2011, and more than 80% of people had no idea as to what palliative care was about. But palliative care has been around for a long time. We've just been talking about it a lot more recently. And it's basically a team of people working together in order to help to improve the lives of patients who have very serious medical illnesses at any stage at all in their life when they may have a serious medical illness. And sometimes those medical illnesses are so serious that they're life-threatening. And for some patients, since there is not always a lot of information about palliative care and people aren't aware of it, we end up seeing a lot of people who were closer towards the ends of their lives. I think the important part is that when we're dealing with palliative care, we're dealing with how to help people that are having symptoms of pain, symptoms of shortness of breath, emotional difficulties, difficulties with knowing how to plan their life and plan what's most important to them when they have a very serious medical illness. And the earlier on in their illness that we can find out and support them, the more that we can offer to them and their families. So palliative care is something that really should start earlier on in patients' illnesses. So many times people equate palliative care with hospice care, but we actually do the same similar things that people do in hospice care, but hospice care is really limited to those people who are at the very ends of their lives.
Well, Anthony, at that point, I've bought my bus ticket. I'm not quite sure what day, but I mean, you think of hospice, hopefully they're not, I'm hoping they won't hand me suntan lotion. You know, I want to be going north, not south on this, but you know, all kidding aside, that is the final. And my understanding is on palliative care, you can start much, much earlier and have a really dramatic effect on people's lives and their family.
Well, it really helps the goal is to improve your quality of life so that every day of your life is as good as it can possibly be. And sometimes starting earlier is really helpful, not only to you as a patient, but to your family, because there's so much stress that the caregivers go through or other family members go through, and sometimes planning ahead and planning for what they're going to need to go through and what kind of support they're going to need, and helping. A lot of times there's so many issues out there in regards to helping people, especially with pain. And we're really specialists in helping people that have chronic illnesses with pain management and things like that. So sometimes if we start a lot earlier on dealing with that, people's quality of life is significantly improved than if you just wait till the last few weeks or months of their life.
But now, what kind of actions can you take?
Well, I mean, I think it's really a part of the continuum of caring for people over their entire life. You know, I'm a primary care physician, so I have a lot of patients that I've been following for over 30 years. You know, I know them very well. They know me well. With many of them, we've been through a variety of crises together. We've been through some operative procedures together. I think it's often been a situation where we've really been focused on doing anything and everything possible to deal with whatever problems arise. And there's no doubt that we have, much better ability to diagnose and treat a whole variety of diseases than what we did when I was first in practice. That being said, no one lives forever, and oftentimes when confronted with a potentially life-threatening illness, I think it's important to begin to understand what is going to be in the person's best interest. Because some things, if they're applied totally indiscriminately, actually can be counterproductive and actually futile and not really provide any specific sort of benefit to a patient. I would acknowledge that we don't always have these conversations as early on as we should. They're difficult conversations, both for patients and their families, but also for providers. These are people we care a lot about.
Sure, but Bill, I've got to admit, I've got to accept my mortality if I'm going to have
Correct.
this discussion with you.
Correct.
I mean, it's hard enough, I want to be young, thin, and have hair. Yeah, people down south want
Right,
ice
and you're the
water.
only person I've ever
Yeah,
heard
exactly.
want that. And I think that's right. And much of our focus is trying to always deal with whatever problem comes up and always provide something which is either curative or corrective or something which is going to hopefully make it better. The problem is that inevitably we will face something for which we have no cure. And I think we're sometimes late to acknowledge that and late to begin to then really have a much different discussion about exactly how do we make the best of the time that's left, what are our priorities in terms of how we want to manage something for which we have no cure. And I do think it's in the purview of a primary care person to have that, but certainly often in these sorts of situations it's helpful to have a consultant who deals with that sort of situation on a much more day-to-day sort of basis.
The era of the primary care physician that you know,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say dodo bird, but
I'm an endangered species.
I was going to say, you think about, the extinct species. When we
Yeah.
grew up in Milford, you could trace your lineage. It didn't matter black, white, Asian, that meant nothing. It was
Dr. Capisi?
Capisi, Cicchetti, Mastriani,
DiPaolo.
four. You had
Right,
four
right,
physicians
right.
in Milford, and that was your lineage. Sex, race, it's who brought you into the world.
Right.
Because that was a primary care physician that, as you got older, would tell you, I brought you in, I know how to take you out. And you could never pull anything over them.
Yeah. Well, again, I have a lot of the same patients I acquired as patients. They were a lot younger when I first met them. I think some of them feel they broke me in when I was a puppy. I got a note today from a patient saying, please don't retire before I die.
Oh, God.
Now, somebody asked me, well, how old is this patient? They're only 64 years old, I think. I think it's an area that we need to be able to handle it better, because I think if we don't have these discussions, we find ourselves in situations where people are on a breathing machine without a prospect of being able to come off, or they're being given cardiac resuscitation when it's not really going to provide them any benefit, or they're not doing that one last thing that they really wanted to do while they were still able.
Well, I think the thing, too, is, and it sounds terribly sexist, so I'll apologize, but I'm a man. I can live through anything. And then you sit there and say, well, welcome to reality. And if you don't start dealing with this issue, forget what you can bear. The effect on your family is something anybody, whether man, woman, whatever, should really take into consideration.
Well, I think what people often do in our society is they consider that fighting is the only way to go, and fighting to live for as long as possible is the only way to live your life. And if you're not a fighter, then you're a quitter, and no one wants to be a quitter. But sometimes it's really important to figure out what your values are and what's most important to you and what's most important to fight for. Because there's a lot of things that we can do with medical technology that can extend people's lives. But are we extending your life to the quality of life that you want to live? And if we are, then that's good. But there's plenty of people who realize now that even though there's a lot of medical technology out there that can do a lot of things, if you can't live the life that you want to live the way you want to live it, sometimes the alternative that we can offer to you is an alternative that is pretty dismal for a lot of people. So having the opportunity to sit down, to look into the future, to predict what may or may not happen, and to talk to your family about what sort of a situation would be acceptable for you and what wouldn't be acceptable for you is something that we haven't done a lot of in the past, and is something that we're really finding is so important and so valuable to so many people to be able to do that.
When you think about it, is there any more fundamental of a decision as to how I want to live my life? And there's no formula.
Right.
The way you decide, or Bill, the way you decide, could be totally different than the way I decide.
I can give you an example of when not having the knowledge that palliative care in the support system was there. I come, knock on wood, from a strong lineage. My mother is 94, has been to Milford Regional many times, more than I care to remember. My father lived until 92, and in October of 8, there was a discussion on starting dialysis because his kidneys were failing. And he was up, my parents were up visiting me in Hopkinton, and he started having problems, was in the hospital, and there was the discussion from the endocrinologist on starting dialysis. And we had the discussion when he was in the hospital, was asking me what I thought, and said, well, we'll talk about it tomorrow. Well, tomorrow never came because he passed away overnight, his heart stopped. And then afterwards was the discussion from his primary care, who was also his cardiologist, was I wouldn't let him do it anyway because he probably would have been too much stress for him. So then you kind of back up as, gee, too bad there was nothing in place and available to sit down and have that discussion, because I truly believe the stress of, do I go for dialysis, do I not go for dialysis, if it didn't cause his heart to stop, it certainly was an issue in the quality of his life in the final days.
Well, you think about it. There's enough stress if something is not working well in my health, situation. Do I really want to add an extra layer? Do I want to exacerbate the tension to have my children or my darling bride have to make decisions wondering, is that what he would have wanted? To me, as hard as it is, yes, I can pretend I'm young, thin, and have hair. I look in the mirror, there's a fat old bald man looking back. So I might as well deal with it and have those discussions up front, at least in my mind, so that if those hard decisions have to be made, at least my family can feel more comfortable that they're doing what I wanted. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, I do think that most families, if they haven't had those discussions, and if in fact the question is posed to them in a relatively desperate sort of situation, what should we do or what do you want us to do? will respond by saying, do everything you can. And everything you can, we know as the medical professionals, is often not the right answer in that sort of situation. And I think one of the things that would potentially have made your dad's situation less stressful to him would be to have his cardiologist and primary care person make a recommendation to him saying, you know, I've known you for a long time. I don't think this is really what I would recommend. We'll do it if you want, and the pros and cons of it are, but just like recommending a treatment for, you know, a person with heart disease or treatment for somebody who has cancer, I do think at end-of-life decisions, we really need to be more making kind of a recommendation and then justifying what the base of that
And I
recommendation
respect
is.
it, especially somebody who's one of the original four or a derivative thereof, who knows me, knows my family. But you know, right now, I can make a conversation happen. And it's I hope it's an academic conversation.
Right.
But I'm not under any pressure to say I have X months, X days, a year. I can have a rational conversation to say, if this ever happened, if that ever happened, I don't want to be a vegetable and have you, personally, I don't want my family coming to see me every day if I'm brain dead.
I think the quality of life issue aspect of it is something that's not discussed as much as it should be, and I think palliative care brings it up to the forefront, because take something like chemo and what people go through in chemo, and it may be a second or third recurrence of cancer. What quality of life do you want? Are you willing to do everything that medically can be done if the time you have left, you're sick and miserable and can't function in the family the way you want? And I think if you have it early enough in the period when you know that the illness is starting, where it might be 10 years down the line or even no idea how long.
John, if Bill came to me and said, we're going to put you on a clinical trial and we could extend your life 4 or 5 years. I got a grandson. He's 2.
Sure. Yeah.
Seeing him at 7, or I had a very good friend who came down with cancer and they told her it would be a year that she had. And she said, no, it's going to be 2.5 years because I'm going to live to see my daughter graduate college. And sure enough, 2 months after her daughter graduated, she took the long bus ride north. Now, if you give me that option, I'll buy on. I'm not sure that if you said there's a new chemo agent that could extend your life by 3 months, but for the next 6 to 9 months, you're going to be miserable. It may be a different decision I would make.
Right.
So many of the times what we do is we sit down and we talk with the care providers who've been caring for that patient and actually helping to guide the patient and the family. Sometimes it's what questions to ask their oncologist in a situation where it may be a cancer. Because sometimes some patients have been going through chemotherapy and they've been doing everything they possibly can. Sometimes the treatments that we provide to patients actually can shorten their lives or make them sicker. Sometimes it's really important to sit down and say that I know that you feel like you're doing everything that you can do in order to extend your life, but sometimes the things that we're doing, such as putting chemicals that could be very poisonous to us in our bodies, can actually shorten our lives. And being able to sit down, and I sit down with the oncologist in the room sometimes, and the patient, and the family who's been watching the patient go through these various different treatments. And it's really important to ask your specialist, you know, if I do this treatment, how much time will this give me? And a lot of times people don't ask that question. And a lot of times people don't even know how much time they have without the treatment, and so that they can't compare that with treatment. And those sorts of things are really important to talk about. And a lot of times, in fact, they did another study that came out last year. It was even in the Boston Globe, how a very large number of doctors are just not comfortable with talking to people about death, or what it might be like to die, or what somebody might want around the time of their death. It's just really hard for physicians to do that, and we haven't had a lot of training in years past with having those conversations. Our conversations are typically, well, there's always one more thing that we can
One
try
more
to do to
clinical trial
extend
we
your...
can try.
Well, I think from a clinician standpoint too, having a patient die is sometimes perceived as a failure on our part. Is there something that we could have done that would have avoided this?
Prove the negative. Prove to me you'll never fall.
Right.
Is there
Right.
something you
Right.
could have done?
But the orientation of our training and our practice and our whole career is to prolong life, avoid death, cure disease. And I think it's often hard to accept the fact that there really isn't anything that we can do that will provide real benefit to a patient that, again, you're quite attached to and have known for a long time.
You got that pesky little Hippocrates guy who made you do an oath. And you say, oh, your whole life is do no harm and do the best for the patient. But it's
Right.
got to be hard to sit there and say, maybe sometimes the best for the patient is not. I mean, I think of chemotherapy, I think of killing the cancer slightly faster than killing the patient. You know, there's a balance.
Although it's different for different cancers, it's different. You know, I have a younger brother who was treated for a lymphoma a couple of years ago, and he's fine now. Now, the treatment was brutal. The treatment was toxic as hell. But, you know, we entered into it knowing that the chances of success were very high, right? Now, there are other types of tumors where the toxicity of the treatment would be just as severe, but the likelihood of success would be much, much less.
And much lower probability
Much lower.
of success.
Now, we are all by nature optimistic, and I think there's anyone who's been doing this for a long time knows a patient who did better than what you thought they would. But I think in reality, a lot of times we're not as candid with the patient as we need to be in terms of what the actual pros and cons are of various things.
But then, Bill, somebody like you, it works against you because you've had that patient since they were born, since, 30 years.
I didn't deliver them. I wasn't.
No,
there.
but I mean, eventually they handed them off, unless you're like my oldest daughter who finally, the pediatric care said, you're 26. It's time to move on. That she just wouldn't change. But, you've been following somebody for 20 odd years.
Yeah.
It's got to be that much harder.
It is that much harder, and in fact, they've done studies on doctors who have been the primary care provider for a patient, as opposed to those who just saw someone more recently in their illness. And it's hard for the primary care providers because it's much more difficult for that person who's been seeing somebody for many, many years to predict exactly when that person may actually die.
We don't want to admit that MDs are human. That yes, you should be objective and be able to park your emotions and your feelings, and you sit there and say, no, they're just people too.
One thing that's very important, though, I'm a huge believer in proxies, and also that a proxy should lead to a discussion with whoever your surrogate decision maker identified in that proxy is about what your wishes would be, because it's really difficult to be in the position of a surrogate decision maker, because a surrogate decision maker always wants to be able to walk away, I did everything that was possible, and that often leads them into decisions that are really futile.
We had a long discussion about selecting your proxy. Because although I may trust you like a brother, if you can't make an objective decision to carry out my wishes, I mean, you got to be kidding me to tell me that I could be objective if I had to make a decision about my daughters or my darling bride, there's no way I'm being objective. You know, about me, yeah, no problem. I can deal with anything you throw at me. Tell me I got X months to go, I'm going to say I had a great life and the best family a man could wish for. But I don't know.
That happens all the time, and people use their own personal values to make decisions for other people, when the understanding should be that the decision that you make for somebody else should be the decision that they would make if they were sitting in the chair next to you having this same conversation, and you're able to make that decision for them. And if you are not able to make the
Then I shouldn't
decision
be their
for
proxy.
them, you should decline being their proxy, and somebody else in the family should do that. And I've been in situations where it was so hard for the proxy that when we had the entire family meeting to sit down and discuss what had happened to a patient, everybody is taking a vote as to what they think should happen, and that's really doesn't
it's-
provide
Hey guys,
every individual
this is me.
their autonomy.
Sorry, it's got to be about me
yeah.
and what.
But without
I
a
want.
proxy, of course, a lot of Milford families have large numbers of children. Many may have somebody that we haven't heard from for a while. And in a crisis, they may show up. You know, they're the person from California who hasn't really had much to do with mom or dad, and not certainly the person who's been bringing them to doctor's visits
Every other day.
and you know, doing their laundry and doing other sorts of things. And in that environment, what happens is the person you haven't heard from for a while often is one of the sons, and the primary caregiver is most often one of the daughters. Without that proxy to empower people to say, this really is the surrogate decision maker, then everyone gets a vote, right? Now, of course, in a situation where I've known the patient for a long period of time and have gotten to know the primary caregiver as well, I can empower that person to be the decision maker and tell people, I understand you don't really agree with this decision. However, unfortunately, you're not a decider here.
And again, if I really care about my family, I'm going to take it on myself to say, I'm going to deal with this. I may have Sally, who's the strongest willed of my children, but I see her once a year.
Right.
Joe, who's quiet, meek, and can be influenced, may be the person I want. Well, I don't want them fighting it out when I'm not of sound
Right.
body or mind. So, you know, I've got to.
That's why it's good to have these conversations ahead of time, if possible. So instead of waiting for those last 6 months of your life or last 3 months of your life or till you're in the intensive care unit, and if possible, if you can write out exactly what it is that you would want, a lot of times it isn't written out clearly, and if it can be disease specific, especially if you have bad emphysema or really bad heart or something else, and some specific issues are anticipated to occur down the road, and you can say specifically, if this and this and this happens, then I want this and this and this, that would be really, really important. But it's also important sometimes to get the people that are from the other side of the country who come over and visit and are very opinionated, because once someone dies, even if your healthcare proxy has made the decisions, they still have to live with the rest of the family for the rest of their lives. And it's better to try to bring everyone together and have everyone fully understand how
So
important these
palliative
decisions
care
were.
can start when you're healthy,
Yes,
or at
it
least
should.
Or at least when you have a problem that has the potential to cause a more serious problem. You know, a good example, as Anthony alludes to, is somebody who has very severe lung disease. And if they have very severe lung disease, the possibility exists that there may need to be a decision someday whether they go on a ventilator.
that's just a road not leading to anywhere pleasant.
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to generalize, but in fact, there are certainly many people in that sort of situation, if they were to end up on a ventilator, would have a great deal of difficulty ever coming off a ventilator. And so the question really needs to be posed, well, If you got to the point where that decision needed to be made, and if in fact the implication of that is you would be on a ventilator for the rest of your life, is that something you would,
How long do you want that to be?
how long do you want that to be? And now most people will say, well, gee, I'd do it if in fact for a short time, if I thought I could get off of the
Like
ventilator.
your brother, I'll put up with anything if I think a
Right.
few months from now
Right,
it's a good outcome.
Right. But in fact, there are certainly some people where the prediction would be fairly certain that if they ended up on a ventilator, it would be very difficult for them to come off. And it's always more difficult to undo something than it is not to do it in the first place.
And just because I wrote it down today doesn't mean in 6 months or a year I can't change it.
That's correct. And nothing is permanently binding, but it's certainly much easier to sort of come up to the situation and then make a decision to sort of backstop or to change or to alter the decision rather than to never have had that conversation and never have to have made any decision at all. Another sort of class of patients that we see that can be helped earlier on are people who have dementia. It's very predictable what will happen to patients with dementia down the road because that, and many people don't consider it to be a life-threatening illness, but it is an illness that can shut down a lot of things. It can make you stop swallowing, it can make you stop walking, it can make you stop eating, it can...
Anthony, 3 years ago, my mother was clear of mind. You know, I mean, I'm married to a saint because when my father passed away 28 years ago, my darling bride understood that leaving my mother in Milford, we were in D.C., alone, she'd be one of those people that withered and would be gone within a year. Because I'm an only child. She moved in with us. My children had their grandmother with them every day, picking them up at the school bus. You know, we never had babysitters. We had grandma. 3 years ago, she had a mini stroke, and it started. Now, today, you can't ask her to sign anything, or the dementia is... The only time it seems to clear is when my grandson shows up. There's some kind of response that her mind becomes clear again for a very short period of time. But, yeah, today, she couldn't make a decision as to what she wants.
Right.
I think revisiting the discussions as things progress. If you talk to many people, and the primary care physician relationship should be stressed, because I think many cases, people who come down with a condition, have a specialist, have the discussion with the specialist, and the specialist may know them for 6 weeks at that point. In talking to people and asking them about the discussions they had when they was diagnosed, invariably a group of people say, I heard you have cancer, and then for 10 minutes I heard blah, 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 blah,
Well,
blah.
yeah, stop.
Heard nothing. So I think being able to step back, revisit, and with the primary care physician or the palliative care physicians you have access to, allows you to take a breath to not only look at the treatment for that specific disease, but look at your whole life, your whole medical treatment. And your primary care physician, again, has known you in many cases for 20 or 30 years, can put everything together for you where that specialist
And
might
John,
not be
think
able to.
about all of us who've had children. I remember that time when we had to decide if Sharon and I got into a car accident and got shipped north on the big bus,
Who was going to care for them?
who's going to care for the kids? And you know, that was a hard decision from the practical side of who do I trust with my children. But for the first time ever, I had to think, I'm not immortal. You know, I could get on that big bus ride north. You know, and now all of a sudden you're saying the same thing, saying, guys, the probability is just a little closer to home that something could happen. But where do I start? I mean, healthcare proxy obviously is step one.
Right.
I want to know that somebody will fulfill my desires. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it's me. So I get to choose. For once in my life, I get to choose an outcome. But then, where do I go for palliative care?
I mean, I think it really is great to be able to, and we're working on this in many different ways, to have the primary care doctors really start initiating a lot of those conversations, and I'm sure that Bill can address that. But a lot of times patients do come down with a cancer or do come down with something more serious, and they end up coming into a hospital. And some of those conversations haven't been had. And so that's a really, really good place to start as well, too.
But where do I go? Do I
Is
stand
that-
there in the Taj Mahal Hopkins, the new ER, and yell, "Anthony, help me"?
You
I mean,
know, there are patients that are saying to their admitting doctors, is it possible for me to get a palliative care consult?
really?
It's interesting, but people are, the word is getting out there and patients are asking. Physicians are now becoming more and more aware that that is an option, to talk with patients that are in the hospital in Milford that have very serious medical illnesses, to sit down with a family and to have conversations. We see a lot of our patients in the intensive care unit. So there's a crisis, somebody gets admitted to the intensive care unit, and now the intensive care unit doctors are requesting that we come in and speak with the families and the patients about what the circumstances are in the ICU. Oncologists are using us more frequently, and the emergency department has really increased the use of asking the palliative care doctors to come down and talk with patients and families about what they're going through and what's really most important to them during a crisis. So unfortunately, when we're dealing with patients in the hospital, it's often during a crisis. And that's a really hard time for families and patients to have these conversations, but people are definitely willing to do that. And
But what are the big areas that you go through? Okay, I've been diagnosed with an indication that is serious. Where do you start? Where do you take me?
well, stroke is a big area. Cancer is a really big area, as we have the Dana-Farber Cancer Center across the street. And we have a lot of cardiologists referring cardiac patients to us, such as congestive heart failure, where they have absolutely maximized every medication that they can possibly maximize. And the patient is still coming into the hospital week after week with congestive heart failure. Their lungs are filling up with fluids. And you know, those patients can be really, really short of breath. Or the patients with the emphysema that the lung doctor has us see that are really, really short of breath. And we need to start talking about other types of medications that we can use to help treat their symptoms when we have completely maximized our traditional medical therapies for patients. And so that's where we start a lot of times, with what bad symptoms somebody might be having: pain, shortness of breath, difficulty swallowing with recurrent pneumonias, things like that. And how can we get those symptoms better, and then how can we move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion shouldn't start in the ICU.
Agreed.
Now, there are certainly some types of problems that occur abruptly. And
If I get into a car accident
Right.
and that causes
But-
irreversible damage, yeah, sorry.
Right.
But again, I would submit to you that now is the time I should talk to my family and all before I get into a car accident, before I
Right.
succumb to Omen's diseases, right?
Right, or at least when we develop a disease that has the potential to cause a foreshortening of our longevity, that we should begin to have at least some discussion of contingency plans. You know, in your mother's case, have a discussion before she's not able to have the discussion. In your dad's case, you know, to have a recommendation made to him because he could make decisions. It was kind of unfair for him to be put in a position where he felt it was his, you know, what do I decide? But you know, I don't know. I mean, I think we need to do better. Our medical technology has now advanced to the point that if the objective is keeping someone alive, we can do that. and can do that with circumstances where they'll never get better.
Well, and again, the only person I ever thought would be more immortal than my father is my mother. You know, she's always been there. She'll always be there. And yet, surprise, one day the world turned.
Right.
You know, and now, I mean, my mother goes to all the hockey games at Holy Cross, all the basketball games. She goes with us everywhere we go. She has no clue where she is.
Right.
You know, so I could not today have a rational discussion with my mother about what her wishes would be. It's too late, and there's nothing, you know, it gnaws at me that there's nothing I can do. I should have forced the issue.
But then as a surrogate decision maker, part of the issue is how do you perceive her quality of existence? And if in fact, even though she doesn't know where she is, if she seems to be happy and seems to be, and if she brightens up when your grandson shows up and so forth, then there may be things which would be relatively, you know, aggressive things that still would be worth considering doing if they gave her a prospect of being able to come back to that level of function. It's not black and white in most of these sort of situations.
Is any medicine?
Well, I think there are some things that are pretty black and white.
Well, I
Yeah,
mean,
but
on the negative side, but I'm saying,
Yeah.
can you really approach any patient with a formulaic, you know, approach? No.
Well, there's
Everybody,
a lot of ambiguity in medicine and in palliative care when we're dealing with helping patients and families make decisions. You have to be comfortable with ambiguity because there's no, as you say, an oncologist says to one patient, you've got 6 months to live, and 3 years later, they're still living.
Sure.
You know, everybody's an individual, and you have to always keep that strongly in mind when you're having these
well,
conversations.
if I knew the outcome, I wouldn't need clinical trials, would I?
No, but in fact, but again, if we were to say, you know, your chances if you get this treatment, it's a bell curve,
Right.
Right.
and you're always going to assume that you're on the, you know,
Far end.
the right side of that curve. But you know, I don't know. I mean, I think we need to have the discussions earlier on. They need to be with people that know us the best. And we need to give at least some direction to people that we've asked to be our decision makers if we are ever in a situation where we cannot make the decision.
And I mean, more and more we're getting better at predictive personalized medicine, where we
Yes.
can look at different transcripts, you know, on the genome and say, well, here's some indicators that you won't do as well on this type of a drug as that one. So we're getting better, but I still don't know of any perfect, you know, predictor of outcome.
No, there aren't perfect predictors of outcome, but there's a lot of information out there that can indicate that if somebody's coming back and forth into the hospital and they've come, you know, into the hospital 6 times in the past year, and they were previously functioning very highly, and now they can't even get out of a chair, and they can't do their regular activities of daily living. They can't feed themselves. They can't get in and out of the shower. They can't do all the usual things. And there's been a predictable decline. There's a lot of information out there as to the life expectancy of people who are on that road of continuous decline, and all you need is a hip fracture or something like that. And there are
And there's the
specific
catalyst that'll
percentages
just send you right off the edge.
that will tell you. And you know, it's really good to prepare for things down the road. That there are a lot of ways in order to have very good predictions for what's likely to occur.
Now, I'm a working person. Can I afford this palliative care, or is this something only for rich people?
It's the same as if you got a cardiology consult, or if you got a lung doctor consult, or if you got an oncologist consult in the hospital. It's all the same. It's paid the same. It's just another provider providing in our system a consult in the hospital. What we do hope at some point in time is just like as your oncologist or your cardiologist or your lung doctor has an outpatient clinic, hopefully at some point in time we would be able to have an outpatient clinic throughout the country. We're really trying to start developing outpatient clinics for palliative care for patients to be able to go to. And in fact, they've started one across the street for the cancer patients at the Dana-Farber Cancer Center. It's very small, but they're trying to increase the number of at least cancer patients that have that available
But you're
on
saying
an outpatient
normal
basis.
people, not the uber rich, but normal people who need a palliative care consult can get it with their insurance.
With their
policy.
insurance, sure.
'Cause I mean,
It's like any other consult, really.
but a lot of times you see these things and people say, is this like concierge medicine that I see on TV that, I could never afford? And what you're saying is no.
No, it's through your regular insurance company.
Now, this is a growing field. I mean, I love the idea that you're doing it outpatient because, it's just like ER. Everybody, we're all very happy that the good Dr. Hopkins has his new Taj and
Yeah.
can take care of us. But when you start looking at what it costs to visit that place,
Yeah.
a lot of the work that's done there can be done at, outpatient centers.
Well, we're trying to do a lot to help support educating primary care doctors in the community. In fact, PFAC is also, the Patient Family Advisory Council is also trying to sort of work with us and work with the hospital, come up with ways of educating primary care doctors as well as educating the community. And I think that I've heard over and over that primary care doctors would like to have more resources available to them so that they are able to do more in their offices. And I actually attended last weekend a conference down at Rhode Island Hospital where the physicians there are really developing programs where they're trying to encourage other providers, nurses, social workers, physicians, to be able to come and practice some of these really difficult conversations that you might have with patients. It's just that it's been around for a long time, but it's new enough that people aren't always comfortable with those conversations, and we're just doing what we can to get it into primary care doctors' offices, as well as to get it into the hospital, and it's just a very rapidly growing process of learning how to do this throughout the country, and Milford is a small community, but we're trying and we're doing this in various different ways.
Yeah, but you were a small community, and we joked about the Little Red Hospital when I was a kid, and now you look at what's offered. It's absolutely amazing. The breadth of services, but the depth of expertise and passion that the medical staff here at Milford shows. Give you a chance, your commercial for PFAC.
Commercial for PFAC, and every spring we're always looking for new members as members leave. Any individual who is interested in the joining of the community with medical care, I would suggest at least looking into PFAC and understanding what it is. It's not, what we try to do is separate. It's not somebody who has a problem with the hospital and wants to try to take care of it. But it's someone who understands that for medical services to be provided, the community has to understand what's there, and the medical center has to have a way to communicate and understand what the community wants. So it's the combination of the two. And I will tell you what's exciting about it is that the last couple of years, the Milford Regional PFAC has been recognized as one of the leading ones in the state, and part of it is the integration with the hospital is so tight. In some cases, the PFAC is, to be honest with you, we have to have it, they're there, let's let them kind of play on their own and let them feel good. That's not the case at Milford. There is so much communications going back and forth. And when we had a meeting last week, and one of the discussions was stroke and how to get stroke recognition out there to the community. And there was a discussion on that, and it's a constant flow of information. So if somebody's interested in medical care in the community, there's no better way to get involved and help getting information out to the community.
And if I was to say Palliative care.
You
What
know?
is the takeaway message you want to leave with people?
I think for situations where people are dealing with potentially life-threatening illnesses or things that could cause some serious difficulty, to focus on optimization of what their quality of life is going to be, what their goals are. You know, the example you use of seeing the person graduate from high school, that may or may not be achievable, but at least to acknowledge that in fact it's an important goal, and
Bill,
we're going
even
to.
if it wasn't, the fact that she was so focused on
Right.
staying as healthy as she could, and I mean, she had end-stage pancreatic cancer. We knew the
Right.
voyage is not going any place that we want it to.
Right.
But even if she didn't make it, those last couple years, and I'm convinced that somehow the goal of wanting to see her daughter walk helped her stay. But even if it didn't,
Right.
her spirits were high because she was bound and determined to last.
But the way I'd look at it is, look, we were dealt a hand that is not the hand we wanted, but we're going to make our very best of the circumstances, both in terms as much as we can understand what the future holds and so forth, that we're all, you know, the family that's left behind is going to be able to look back and say that we did the very best we could with a bad situation.
And realistically, think of the family you're leaving behind and try and make it. I know it's hard. I'm facing an issue and I'm worried about my family. Well, yeah, that's what we did our whole life. Make it easier on them because the final days are going to be hard enough.
You can support your family so that there's a legacy that you leave behind that is a memory, especially a memory when it becomes those last days, that they can always remember as being a period. It was always sad, but there's always that wonderful opportunity to have said your goodbyes, and sometimes you have had the opportunity to say what was really most important to you, to say to your family
And with
members.
that, I'll say thank you for taking on a topic that none of us want to deal with.
Yeah.
And to our 6 loyal viewers, I hope you'll get a better feeling every time we do one of these shows of how deep the passion, the caring, and how wide the breadth of services that, you know, the Milford Medical Center does offer us right here. So as always, thank you. May
Thank
God
you.
bless.
Thank you.
Good night, and may tomorrow be a healthier day than today. Good night.